Am I literally just
Victoria, can you hear us?
I can hear you. Hello.
Okay, perfect. We'll just mute everything until everyone comes in, but I just want to make sure it was working.
Thanks. Hello. Hi. Can you see the full screen of my presentation?
Hello. We can see your presentation. Can you bring it into presentation view, please?
Yeah, it is presentation view on my end. I think you guys might actually need to share my screen again or something.
Yeah, I just mentioned that. Can you? Yeah. Hi.
Do you have multiple monitors?
Yes, I'm trying to plug that in now.
Okay.
No, we're starting to Victoria's virtual first.
Yeah, could you make it so
She said 30 minutes.
the screen that you share is the one in presenter view? Because we're seeing your other monitor right now.
I'm actually was only on one screen, only on my laptop,
Okay.
but I can go on the screen if you need.
That's fine.
Also, so you know, there's about a 30-second delay.
Yeah, unfortunately, we were having this problem with the whole Event Mobi software.
Yeah.
Can we make this bigger?
Yep.
Did that help?
We'll go with that.
What happens when she advances slides?
Can you advance a slide for us, please?
Yes, I am.
We still see the title slide.
Yeah.
Can you share
Like the whole screen.
You have to share your full screen, not just through the window.
I'm-
The Event Mobi should have an option where it's like a window, like you share, and then it's a window and then a full screen. Because every time she goes to presenter mode, it leaves that window.
Yeah. The only, sorry, there's a huge delay. So I need to just plug in a second monitor to be able to do that. Otherwise, it minimizes my PowerPoint screen every time I try to connect. So I'm just connecting another screen, another monitor. 2 seconds.
Okay.
While Victoria is doing that, I guess I'll go ahead and introduce the session while we work out some of the bugs. So thank you all for joining us today. I'm Adam Kirkwood. Sophie
Wilkinson.
and excited to have a good session today on peatland disturbance and policy in Canada. So I'll start introducing Victoria while she gets set up. Victoria is from the Wildlife Conservation Society Canada and is going to be talking to us about work that her and the team are doing on assessing Canadian law and policy for peatlands. And then after that, I think we have a really nice repertoire of peatland presentations, including some bits of permafrost, which are near and dear to my heart. So we'll give another minute. Victoria was the invited speaker, so she'll have a 30-minute session, now a 25-minute session, so we might have to trim a bit of time for questions. but I'm sure you'd be able to connect with Victoria afterwards if you have any like super burning questions. Have you been able to share, Victoria?
Hi, everyone. Sorry, I'll just note that there's about a 30-second delay, so I don't hear your questions for about 30 seconds. So no, it's not working on my end. So I'm wondering, Adam, if there another option? Email you my...
We have them on Dropbox, so I can share on here, and then you can talk and tell me when to switch slides. Yeah, let's do that. Okay.
Actually, I need some updates, so I'd rather...
It wasn't working. It was just keeping on her. Oh. If you share your whole thing and then don't go into presenter mode, we'll be able to see your PowerPoint as you go through. You'll just have to keep it in like the full PowerPoint version. Thanks for your patience, everyone.
I was actually never in presenter mode. This was always just the full PowerPoint on one screen. Okay, well, let's just... Sorry, everyone.
Let's try sharing the slides on here. Can I get help with doing that, please?
Adam,
Yeah.
how's that?
One second.
Adam, I'd actually really rather not. If I email you, I update me some updates.
What you say? We can see that, Victoria. Oh.
Let's go with that.
She's calling because there's a delay. Hi. No, we're sorry. We can see your screen right now. Yeah, we can see this right now. If you can present like this, I know it's not ideal, but we can hear it or see it. No. If you click through like this, can you present that way? Yeah. Like right now, we see this slide in the big green box.
Have you had anybody else present virtually?
Yeah, we already have it on the Dropbox, so I'll pull it
And
up.
how did it work?
Oh, you
I think that's how I think each of us working good.
She's asking if she can email it to us, and then
Like we're 10 minutes behind
I know.
schedule. We have to find someone to download it and move it into our folder.
It's not in Dropbox here.
Okay, thanks, Victoria. Give that a try. So Victoria is going to go ahead and present this way. Thank you for your patience, and the floor is yours, Victoria. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. Okay, I'm so sorry. I had a feeling that I'm not necessarily technically savvy. Okay, I'm not sure if you can hear me. Sorry, there's such a delay. There's a lot going on. Okay, I'm just going to go through it. I'm so sorry for the delay. Now I'm hearing myself. Okay, let's go. So I am here today to talk to you about peatland law and policy in Canada. So again, really apologize for those technical issues. My name is Victoria Goodday. I work with Wildlife Conservation Society Canada. Good news is that my presentation is only about it should be fun. You know what? I'm going to have to turn off the volume because I'm hearing myself about 30 seconds after. Okay. So Adam, just record me if something's wrong. So I'm here to talk about peatland law and policy in Canada. I'm the policy lead for the Forest Climate Change team at Wildlife Conservation Society Canada, as I mentioned. Very quickly about our work. So the Forest, Peatlands, and Climate Change Program, we use a combination of field-based geospatial and policy research and engagement to make change happen. We provide research, expert advice, and conduct outreach. The work I'm presenting here today, I'm not going to try to fiddle with any more of the view. I think we're okay, hopefully. The research I am talking about today was conducted under the National Peatland Policy Project. The objective of this project is to develop a proposed national strategy for the protection, restoration, and long-term restoration of peatlands in Canada. The activities towards this end are policy research and analysis, so desktop-based, also direct engagement with knowledge holders across the country. We're producing a variety of publications and communications as a result. Ultimately, the outcome is, or the aimed for outcome will be strengthened peatland policy and planning. Our project is led by Dr. Lorna Harris, and myself, and Laura Tangway is our policy analyst, and Nicola Rodaitis-Smith is our research and outreach assistant. So the work I'm speaking about today was a team effort here. The focus of this presentation specifically, I want to talk about some of our initial findings, but specific to what policy mechanisms are used to protect peatlands in Canada and are they working. Just going to start a timer. What a way to start a presentation. I'm so sorry for that delay. And yeah. Okay, here we go. So first of all, I want to provide some framing around why maybe we should and why we personally, our team cares about peatland policy. You can't see all that. Hopefully that helps. So Canada has an outsized global responsibility to protect peatlands. Roughly 1/4 of the world's remaining unconverted peatlands are in Canada. A lot of you in the room, I'm sure, will know this information. Canada also contains some of the world's largest remaining high-integrity peatland complexes. For example, the Hudson Lowlands, which is the second largest in the world, and the Mackenzie River Basin, which is also of note. These peatlands and the carbon stored within them are critical to a net zero future. So they have absolute global importance, keeping that carbon in the ground. Canada's peatlands contain roughly 28% of global peatland carbon stock, totaling an estimated 150 gigatons of carbon. And as we know, peatlands provide a myriad of other essential ecosystem services beyond carbon. For the purposes of this work I'm presenting here today, there is a large climate services carbon focus, but I don't want to downplay the importance of peatlands' other ecosystem services. Here is a map that my colleague Meg Sophie prepared. It shows estimated peatland carbon stock by province and territory. You can see that Ontario, Manitoba, Northwest Territories, and Alberta have the most peat carbon within their bounds. I mostly want to show this today just to make the point that the regulatory and policy context and frameworks differ quite widely. There are a lot of similarities, but they're all different based on provinces and territory. You know, as many of you may know, the responsibility for managing natural resources is devolved to the provincial and territorial levels. And so this is what the main focus of my talk is today, policy and law, and that is primarily determined by the province or territory that you're in. So again, Canada has this global responsibility. We also, our country is a signatory to many multilateral agreements that oblige Canada to protect biodiverse and climate important ecosystems such as peatlands. Global leading authorities and agencies have called for national and subnational policy action on peatlands for over probably around 20 years now, very explicitly, and have put out recommendations for what those policy frameworks should include. And so the agencies I'm going to focus on today are the Food and Agriculture Organization, UN Environment Program, and Ramsar Secretariat. So when we look at Okay, maybe I don't need to go so quickly. When we look at the guidance that these organizations have put out, we can see that there's some key themes and key elements to include in national and subnational peatland policy frameworks. So again, this is global guidance. Canada is in a unique position in that we have some of the world's only remaining large unconverted peatland complexes, opposed to other states, for example, the UK, which has a lot of degraded peatlands, and maybe have some different issues to grapple with. But still, when we look at the key elements and the key guidance here, this is still applicable to Canada. So I've put here 8 key elements. This is a synthesis of key recommendations from these 3 groups, FAO, UNEP, and your Secretariat. So I'm just going to go through really quickly to provide that framing of, ideally, or actually maybe bare minimum, this is what we want to see at the national and or subnational levels. So we want to see policies that promote conservation of intact peatlands and application of the mitigation hierarchy. We want to see peatland assessment and inventories in place, so a robust understanding of where peatlands are and what types and what services are they providing. We want peatlands to be considered in protected areas and land use planning. We want to see restoration of degraded peatlands. So again, that focus of restoration should be on already degraded peatlands. We want regulatory frameworks that promote conservation and disincentivize degradation and conversion. We want collaboration and systems of co-governance, sufficient funding that promotes conservation, and then monitoring and reporting of all of these actions and the funding flows to support them. So that's a lot. In general, that's what these groups have been calling for quite a while now. So our work, we looked at what is in place in Canada. How is Canada doing? What law and policy is in place to protect peatlands? And I'm going to go through our preliminary findings. Our methods, we conducted a systematic policy review. The research question, again, was focused on the carbon services of peatland. The question was, what law and policy is in place in Canada to protect peatlands and their essential carbon services? We conducted a review of law and public policy using key terms to represent both peatlands and parent categories like wetlands and water resources, and carbon-rich ecosystems, carbon reservoirs, carbon sequestration, anything that related to ecosystems and their carbon services, as well as those parent categories of wetlands and water resources. And then we conducted a qualitative data analysis categorizing peatland relevant provisions. So the results, we came up with 203 different law and policy documents, which I'm going to call instruments today, that had provisions or rules directly applicable to peatlands. So these documents, these instruments were active and in force as of December 31st, 2023. And again, they had provisions directly applicable to peatlands. So that was the inclusion criteria. We also have been conducting direct engagement. Some of you may be in the room. Those folks we've spoken with. We've been speaking with peatland knowledge holders across Canada, across sectors and regions. We've spoken to over 80 folks. We've been discussing policy implementation, gaps and opportunities, so kind of ground truthing the results of that policy review. And we've identified common themes and trends. So here are kind of 6 high-level key findings. Okay, we're going to do okay for time. 6 high-level key findings. Let me just make sure Adam's not trying to commute. Okay, good. He's not trying to get a hold of me. Okay, so I'm just going to run through these pretty quickly and then focus on 3 of them before getting into a discussion about the mechanisms. So number 1, we found that there are fragmented, outdated policy frameworks at play all across Canada, often with competing objectives and outcomes. 2, the unique carbon services of peatlands and wetlands more broadly are largely ignored across almost all areas of policy. 3, peatlands are treated primarily as an economic resource to be exploited. So where there is law and policy in place specific to peatlands, it's usually about exploiting peatlands for peat. Number 4, peatlands are not prioritized for protection and are sometimes less protected than other wetlands. 5, avoidance of harm is not sufficiently incentivized. There's a lack of mechanisms to require avoidance, weak compensation and restoration requirements. And 6, Indigenous leadership and continued stewardship is not adequately supported. So these are key findings that are true across all regions of Canada right now. I want to dive into the first 3 findings, hopefully briefly. So first, fragmented, outdated policy framework. So here's a pie chart showing the different policy areas represented by all of those 203 applicable law and policy instruments. So most of the instruments were in the water resources realm. So most of the law and policy applicable to peatlands were in water resources. Then land use planning and development, then climate related policy and law, forestry, general protection and environmental management, peat extraction, wetland specific policy, parks and protected areas, agricultural law and policy, and then a few others in there, including peatland specific law and policy, and that's only found in Manitoba at present. Actually, sorry, there are a couple instruments in Alberta as well, and one in New Brunswick. So broad range, 14 policy areas apply to peatlands. So what that really means in practice is that there are different decision makers, different governing bodies, different agencies associated with all of those areas, all with different mandates. And all of those policies and even policy areas often have different objectives. So there are a lot of demands on peatlands, and there's a lack of coordination around what ultimately are the objectives we want to achieve related to peatlands, and are we achieving them? The unique carbon of services of peatlands and wetlands more broadly are ignored. So I want to just touch on this for a second. So of those 203 documents or instruments, 75% do not recognize the carbon services of wetlands. And this is majorly an issue in law. So the carbon services of wetlands or specifically, are not reflected in legislation. So there's a lack of legislative and protection around peatlands and wetlands for their carbon services. There is a trend, however, of increasing recognition of the carbon services provided by wetlands. And that's seen in more recent years, more policy that notes those services. The carbon link is especially missing from wetland policy. So only half of wetland-specific policies across the country acknowledge the carbon services of wetlands. In climate policy, only 5 of 14 current climate plans explicitly mention peatlands. So that's up quite a bit from previous. Of those 5, I think only 1 had mentioned peatlands in one jurisdiction in their previous climate plan. So again, that trend is increasing, or there's an increasing trend. And then national greenhouse gas emissions, as I'm sure some of you in the room really understand better than I do, there's a huge gap there related to peatlands. So our national inventory report misses almost all human-caused disturbances to peatlands and greenhouse gas emissions fluxes from natural disturbances such as permafrost, thaw, and peat extraction. So in a law and policy related to peat extraction, the economic considerations, so the formulas that go into determining whether it makes economic sense to extract an area, they don't account for land carbon. And restoration regimes often don't account for irrecoverable carbon. So there's not adequate emissions accounting or financial accounting there. And also sometimes peatlands are not required to be returned to peat producing ecosystems. That's more so true for other forms of disturbances. So yeah, this is, I really want to try to zoom out. I'm not going to mess up the view. Apologies for not being able to see things very well here. But and then the third point I want to focus on here, our peatlands are treated primarily as an economic resource to be exploited. So that's where where there is law and policy specific to peatlands, it's usually about peat extraction, and where there are special protections in place for peatlands, it's almost always about protecting the peatland for the purpose of future exploitation for peat. So you can see in this graph, hopefully, that under wetland-specific policy, there are special protections in place for peatlands. That's 5 of the 16 documents. I'm just checking Adam's message. 5 minutes late. Okay, thank you. So in 4 or 5 of those cases of wetland policy, the protections for peatlands are again about preserving that peatland so it can be exploited for peat. Okay, I'm gonna move forward here and talk. So these key findings are published in our policy brief that was out in November. I'm gonna move through quickly and talk about our key findings around main policy mechanisms used for peatland protection. So broadly speaking, across Canada, there are kind of 6 main mechanisms used for peatland protection. First one is effects minimization and compensation. So that's a part of the mitigation hierarchy. Next one is protected areas designations. Next is land use planning, then species at risk protections, then water resources protections, then market-based mechanisms. So all of these have limitations. So for effects minimization and compensation, just really quickly, I'll highlight one. There is an absolute failure to avoid harm to peatlands in the first place. And then where if impacts are allowed that are required to be minimized or compensated for, those regimes are insufficient to deter avoidance, and they don't adequately account for the loss of essential services of the peatland. Protected areas designations, wetland protection designations often deprioritize peatlands. So they do this by not, so this is like special designations for special wetlands to protect. So they may not include consideration of carbon, but they may focus on connectivity with the broader water system. So bogs are therefore not represented and less valued. And they may even value like more scarce wetlands in a more populated area more highly. Okay, just maybe we will. Okay. And land use planning. So land use planning, we've seen a lot of success around in terms of peatland protection. However, it is time intensive and resource intensive. It takes many actors, which is also a real benefit and an advantage of it, but it does take time and it may lack legislative teeth. Species at risk protection. So one limitation there is that it's conditional. It applies only to select peatlands where we know there are species at risk inhabiting that place. And so therefore that relies on strong mapping and data, which isn't always available, and the process might be flawed around how that habitat is defined. And water resources protection, again, bogs are not included because they are not connected to the groundwater system or surface water system. Market-based mechanisms, I could speak all day on this. There are many limitations, mostly related to there aren't any appropriate protocols developed yet for large-scale remote peatlands, and that's due to things like challenges of proving avoided emissions, carbon fluxes under climate change and wildfire scenarios, and unclear jurisdiction. Okay, I'm gonna wrap it up here. The takeaway I want to leave you with, and again, sorry for how rushed this is there is no silver bullet. I know this is a bit of a negative framing today with all the limitations, but there are advantages to each approach on the other side. There's no silver bullet. We need a diverse mix of mechanisms. We know a lot. People around the country have tried a lot and know a lot, and it's ready for policy action. And we need fit for purpose, peatland-specific tools, approaches, and capacity. Next steps, we recommend we develop a coordinated national strategy, we build capacity and awareness, and we address those policy gaps. Thank you. Okay, I'm gonna get out of here.
Thanks so much, Victoria. We really appreciate you speeding through your talk, but super interesting. I think because there's such a big lag between us and Victoria, we will not take questions at this point, but if you want to connect with Victoria or the National Peatland Policy Team, I can share the email and I will introduce our next speaker. So thank you so much, Victoria. That was awesome. Our next speaker is Veronica Santia. So if you want to come on up, Veronica is going to be talking about quantifying greenhouse gas emissions across different vegetation communities.
Am I crazy?
Is there anybody?
Yeah, there's Let me just double check this. That was faster than expected.
You good online?
Theoretically, you should be able to use this.
Okay, can I test? Oh,
Okay.
wonderful.
Perfect.
Okay. Oh, dear. Oh, it's still alone.
It's still showing the
Yeah.
Can you not click the box? Yeah, click here. Okay. Okay. Oh, yeah, there you go. Okay. All right, my hand. Okay. All right, good morning, everyone. I'm Veronica Santia from the University of Waterloo, and today I will be presenting on part of my Master's of Science research titled Quantifying Greenhouse Gas Emissions Across Vegetation Communities on a Peat Stockpile in Northern Alberta. So you might ask, what are peat stockpiles? So I will give a brief background on peat stockpiles and oil sands mining. So for mining companies to create new infrastructure on the landscape, first they have to strip peatlands of their vegetation and their peat layers. And those peat layers then get put into a stockpile where they sit for a long duration of time, often 40 or 50 years while the mine site is being in use. And so when the stockpiled peat is sitting, there are shifting variables such as soil temperature, soil moisture, and the availability of vegetation. And so upon decommissioning of those mine sites, that stockpiled peat is then used as reclamation soil in the landscape that was previously excavated. And so the greenhouse gas emissions from peat stockpiles are relatively unknown due to the drastic differences that they experienced in their stockpiled setting versus the natural setting that they're in the landscape. And so oftentimes vegetation is planted on these stockpiles to reduce things such as erosion and potentially to help mitigate those emissions. And very few studies have actually looked at the greenhouse gas emissions on peat stockpiles. And those that have suggest that all carbon is lost during the initial stripping and stockpiling process. So for some of you that might be more familiar with the size of horticultural peat stockpiles, this is just a brief comparison of the two. So in the oil sands, peat stockpiles are very large. The Aspen lease, which is where I currently work, has two peat stockpiles, one being 1 hectare in size, and the one that this study takes place on is actually 6 hectares in size. And once these are constructed, like previously mentioned, they stand for a long time, so 40 or 50 years. And they normally have a high soil moisture due to being directly transported from the landscape into the stockpiled setting and no changes during that time. And then they're composed of varying materials. So you'll get acrotelm stockpiles, which is the surface layers of peat. You'll get catatelm stockpiles, which is those deep peat layers, and that is actually what this study takes place on. And sometimes you'll actually get mineral soil mixed throughout just due to the imprecision of the construction. Whereas in the horticultural industry, you have smaller stockpiles. The standing duration is up to several months, and the extraction and stockpiling process is a continuous process until they deem that it's not economically viable. And they normally have a lower soil moisture, and peat is milled before actually being placed in those stockpile settings, and they're mainly composed of sphagnum. So what are the main research questions and objectives of the study? So my main research question, first one being, what are those carbon emissions on the peat stockpile? And how do the emissions vary with those different vegetation communities and with stockpile elevation? And what is the net carbon balance of that stockpile? So is that a large source, or is it still acting as a sink? And the objectives are to just evaluate those carbon emissions, measure biomass accumulation, and to determine total plant inputs and see if that differs amongst vegetation communities, to analyze the stockpile elevation impact, how the elevation impacts carbon emissions, and lastly, to calculate that net stockpile-wide carbon balance using flux and biomass data. So how did I set up the stockpile for the study? So we did weekly CO2 and CH4 fluxes using the closed chamber method. And so as you can see on the left-hand side, I just have a map of the stockpile, roughly 6 hectares in size, which is approximately 60,000 meters squared, just to put this into perspective. And so I have designated different locations where I installed those collars. So the stockpile has 4 slope locations, north, south, east, and west. And within each slope location, there's a middle collar and a bottom collar, both being bare organic. And I do have some slides later on that show what these look like. And then on the surface, there are 4 depression locations, and those depressions are low-lying areas on the landscape, higher soil moisture. For the first part of the season, there was a water table above surface, and they are dominated by sedges, whereas at the elevations, they are a little bit elevated on the landscape, much drier, and mainly grasses and some small shrubs. And within each of those 8 locations, there's an intact collar, a clipped collar, and a trenched collar. So here's what the slope collars look like. Again, no vegetation, just bare organic, and you can actually see some mineral soil at the bottom of that right photo. And then looking at what the collars look like on top of the stockpile. So on the left-hand side, it's an intact collar measuring net ecosystem exchange, gross ecosystem productivity, as well as ecosystem respiration. The middle collar, the vegetation was clipped out, and we are just isolating root respiration and peat respiration. And then on the right-hand side, we have a trenched collar where it's just bare organic to kind of mimic those conditions that we're seeing on the stockpile slopes. And so this one is just isolating peat respiration, and we trenched around the collar so that way no roots or vegetation could grow into it laterally. So looking at some results with carbon fluxes and vegetation communities. So the overall trend that we were seeing was that the depression locations, which are those high soil moisture, mainly sedge areas, had a large range in net ecosystem exchange, which can be explained by that larger GEP. So we're seeing greater uptake at those locations, but also a larger ecosystem respiration. So there's also greater release at those locations, likely just due to the varying soil moisture over the season. Like I mentioned, there was a standing water table above surface, slowly retreated below, but also just the amount of vegetation that was found at those locations. So a lot of vegetation available for uptake, but also for release as well. And then we see less variation at those elevation spots, a lot drier and less vegetation overall. And there were no significant differences amongst those vegetation communities for GEP, NEE, or ER. And then looking at the methane data, so there was significantly more methane emitted at those depressions, which was kind of expected just due to the presence of sedges, which is allowing that methane to bypass being oxidized, and the higher soil moisture and standing water table above surface. So going into the biomass data, on the left-hand side of the graph, we can see the above ground biomass. So there were no significant differences between the depression and elevation locations, although we did see a little bit more carbon stored in biomass at those depressions, again, just because there was more vegetation overall. And then looking at the below ground biomass, there was significantly more carbon stored in biomass at the depressions, just due to those sedges and how deep rooting they are versus what we're seeing at the elevation areas with those shallow rooting grasses and shrubs. And then getting into the stockpile elevation and the differences between the carbon fluxes. On the left-hand side, we can see ecosystem respiration amongst the bottom, middle, and top. And so this was using the data collected from the slope locations as well as the trenched locations on top of the stockpile, because they were all bare peat and we could compare them. We were initially hypothesizing that the top of stockpile collars would have had significantly more respiration just due to there being more peat located underneath the collar. That was not the case, and we kind of see a large range amongst all different elevations. But then moving into the methane graph on the right-hand side, we're seeing large variation in methane on the top of stockpile collars. Again, likely due to there being sedges present up there in the surrounding areas, as well as just higher soil moisture overall. And then very little variation and very little methane actually being produced on those middle and bottom collars, but there were no significant differences amongst those for methane or for ecosystem respiration. So looking at the stockpile net carbon balance, which we calculated using the biomass data as well as the carbon flux data. So the net carbon balance of the stockpile is estimated to be around 539 grams of carbon per meter squared per year. And as I mentioned previously, the stockpile is around 60,000 meters squared. So you can just imagine if you scaled this up, how much carbon you're losing annually on the stockpile. And so this value suggests that, as previously thought, not all carbon is actually lost during that initial stripping and stockpiling process, as those few studies have mentioned. Even after 6 years, the stockpile is still a high carbon source. And so we didn't just lose all that available carbon when we initially created the stockpile. And so looking at the diagram at the bottom, we can see the different partitioning of respiration and NPP. So on the top of the stockpile, we see respiration from the soil around 652 grams of carbon per meter squared per year, whereas NPP only offsets around 108 grams of carbon per meter squared per year. And then on the slopes of the stockpile, respiration from the soil is around 612 grams of carbon per meter squared per year, and is only NPP is only offsetting around 85 grams of carbon per meter squared per year. So why is this important? Why is this study significant? So this study is actually one of the first to quantify greenhouse gas emissions from peat stockpiles in the oil sands. And so size, vegetation presence, soil moisture, as previously mentioned, all affect the carbon emissions and the ability of this peat to actually be used as reclamation soil after mine decommissioning. And so the data is necessary for those accurate lease scale emissions reporting and annual estimates of peat stockpile related carbon emissions. And lastly, the data will add to our overall minimal knowledge of national scale estimates of carbon losses in wetlands resulting from oil sands operations. And I'd just like to acknowledge that this work took place on lands within the Treaty 8 territory in northern Alberta and on the traditional lands of the Fort McKay First Nation and the Fort McKay Métis Nation. And I'm super grateful for all the help that I had during last year's field season from Emma, Kira, and Natasha at the back. And I'd also like to thank members from my lab, Miranda and Carissa. And the study would not have been possible without our funding from NSERC, Imperial Oil, Ducks Unlimited, and Environment and Climate Change Canada. And I think that's all. Thank you.
Wonderful work, Veronica. I had no idea a stockpile could be so big. So we've got time for a couple of questions. We've got Florian here.
Thank you. I'm in love with your work.
Thank you.
It packs such a punch. I think this type of work is one of the most impactful because it does go to the core of the folly that happens in the oil sands region. Just a quick question on the below ground biomass, how did you calculate it? How did you measure it? Sorry.
So we took a 50 centimeter peat core and we split that into the bottom 20, middle 20 centimeters, and top 10. And then we basically sat there and picked out every single root that we
Right.
deemed was living. It took quite a while, but then again, dried, weighed, and used the allometric equations to calculate carbon storage in the roots.
So that would be total root growth regardless of, because, I'm thinking of, in-growth bag method that has its problems, but it calculates new growth rather than just picking up roots that may be from biennial plants, for instance, or, like older roots. So
Yeah.
you would overestimate the below ground a bit.
Yeah, we did try to just pick what was living. So those like
Right,
thicker roots that we thought would be from sedges or shrubs
Right.
and stuff. But like you mentioned, there was definitely a possibility of older
course.
roots being in there as well.
Anyway, awesome work.
Thank
you
you.
so much.
Thank you.
How are we doing on time?
It's 11:50, but maybe one super quick one.
Are you fast?
That was a great presentation. Do you have any idea what the active layer may be on the stockpile in terms of like vegetation, rooting depth, or biological activity there?
I'm not too sure. When we did the below ground biomass, basically there was like no rooting after like I'd say 20-ish centimeters. So I think the majority of stuff that was happening was above that.
Okay, awesome. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, thank you, Veronica.
All right, next up we have Emma Wagner, who will be talking to us about wildfire impacts on methane emissions.
Hi, everyone. Great presentation, Veronica. That was fantastic. My name is Emma Wagner, and I am a PhD student at the University of Guelph. But today I'm going to be talking a little bit about my master's work with Dr. Maria Strack at the University of Waterloo. And that focused on the carbon cycling aspects of wildfire recovery, and particularly the methane emissions, and looking more into long-term cycling. So, within 10 years. So I'll just go through a little bit of background. I know we're mostly peat people in here, so I won't get too deep into the nitty-gritty, but as we know, peatlands are organic accumulating systems, and this is primarily due to a very high water table. And this prevents rapid decomposition because of the limited oxygen. And so methanogenesis occurs in lieu of that carbon dioxide decomposition. And so this methanogenesis, while it takes place in anoxic conditions, increases with the water table height as this water table provides these anoxic conditions. And so this generally makes fens and most peatland systems resilient to wildfire. They've kind of evolved with these wildfires to renew the systems. And so they've been able to work together. So we see that when fires burn, they kind of burn the top layer of peat, the biomass above ground, but it's not actually energetically favorable for the fires to continue burning deep within the peat. And so what we see traditionally are these moderate burns. And our current estimates of recovery are about 10 years. It's on a decadal timescale, and these estimates are from Weider et al. From 2009. And this is based on an ombrotrophic system chronosequence. But what we're seeing with climate change is that wildfires are becoming much more severe and much more frequent than they were traditionally. So instead of these moderate burns, we're having much more severe burns. So wildfires are burning into this peat, which is releasing CO2 to the atmosphere. This is causing further global warming, which in the Boreal region is causing reduced precipitation events and increased temperatures, causing drier peat, causing more severe fires. And so what we see, again, are these more severe burns. And so the objective of my study was to quantify the methane fluxes in a fen along a fire severity gradient. And this is important for a number of reasons, but primarily what I was interested in is getting more accurate accounting of carbon. So like Victoria was talking about earlier today, we don't have really accurate Earth system models that can tell us what's happening during the recovery events of wildfires in peatlands. So in simpler terms, my question was, how did depth of burn and peatland type influence the timing of recovery from wildfire? And when I talk about recovery throughout this presentation, I'm just talking about similarity to the unburned treatment. So what we did was picked one peatland system that had varying depths of burn throughout it. And we measured methane weekly from May to August in 2022 and 2023. I also did all of that extra work in the second point. That's not relevant for this presentation, but it was a lot of work, so I just like to talk about it. And then in 2017 and 2018, Dr. Scott Davidson collected the same data from the same sites and often the very same callers. So we compared this data to see kind of a trajectory of what's happening over time. So what we found is that there is significant temporal variation. And what this means is that just interannually, we see differences in methane fluxes. So for example, if we look at the unburned box plot at the very left there, in 2017, there wasn't really a lot of variability in the methane that was being emitted from these systems. And in 2022 and 2023, we see a lot more variability there. And this can be traced back to differences in the climate. So in 2017 and 2018, the climate was much drier. If we think back to what I was saying earlier about the higher water table driving more methanogenesis, this makes sense that a drier year, less methane production. And then in 2022 and 2023, we see more methane activity and production, and it was a much wetter year comparatively. And so we can kind of account for those differences in between years, but if we look between sites, we get a little bit of a more interesting story. In 2017 and 2018, we can see that there is a little bit of activity in methane production at the unburned site. And if we look at the moderately burned and severely burned sites, there's not really a lot going on. They're kind of hovering around zero. So what we suspect has happened is that the fire has burned through and burned off these methanogenic communities. If we look at the 2022 and 2023 data, we can see that there's quite a lot more activity in the unburned site. Like I said, that's very much a factor of the climate. But when we look at the moderately burned site, we see that there is what I'd like to think of as quite a lot of recovery in terms of how much activity there is in the methanogenic community. We see the same thing a little bit at the severely burned site, but it's not quite back to what we would like to consider its original state, or the unburned treatment. Burn severity and water table were also significant influences on methane fluxes. And so I'll talk a little bit about the water table and its influence. And we basically see a lot of the same thing. So if we look at the 2017 and 2018 data, we have the yellow dots on the graphs. We can see that there was a little bit of activity within the unburned site, and that's a lot like the box plots. So we kind of expect that in the unburned site, it's going to be functioning like we would expect pretty normally. So a little bit of methane being emitted. And then in the burned sites, we see, again, kind of hovering around zero. And then if we look at 2022 and 2023's data, we see this unburned site is a lot more active, a lot more methane production. And this is also the case in the moderately burned site. So there's a lot more activity, and we suspect that this methanogenic community has been able to regenerate itself. Now, the severely burned site does kind of look a little bit similar. I just want to point out that those are only 4 data points that are kind of skewing the way the graph looks. There's thousands of points along the bottom that we're not really seeing, so don't let that fool you. And so this has been a pretty quick, short presentation, but it all just goes to say that recovery trajectories are really super variable. We can't just have this single prescribed decade timescale that speaks for how all fires are going to recover. because fires aren't different. There's different peatland types, different wetland types, and then also different burn severities. So having just this one 10-year timescale is just not realistic. We also know that these increasing burn severities haven't yet been included in our system models. And so for more accurate carbon accounting, we'll need to include these longer timescales in Canada's carbon estimates. I want to acknowledge that I did a lot of this work on many different treaty lands. And then I also just want to thank everybody that helped with this work. It certainly was not done alone, as well as all of our funders. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Emma. We can take questions now. I have a question. If I don't see a hand. I'll go first, Colin. Super interesting. I agree there needs to be more nuance and work on that 10-year number that we like to throw out there. So my question is, in the severely burned area, did you see that it was drier than the moderately burned or wetter? I know there's trade-offs with the energy balance, but also you've moved the surface of the ground further down. So how did that play out?
Yeah, I would have to look at the data, and I'm doing my PhD, so I'm not really looking at that so closely anymore. But from what I recall, it was quite a lot drier at the severely burned site.
Interesting. All right, Colin, we'll head over here. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll echo Sophie's comments. It's really interesting, and we need to be thinking more about kind of the recovery and kind of evolution. Oh, there we go. All right. Oh. So you mentioned the methanogen communities that you think there's like an absence of them. Do you think, and this is kind of just more, I'm not expecting an answer more or less, but just your thoughts on whether you think it's a biological control where the communities just haven't re-invaded, I guess, or if there's some sort of physiochemical control where it's maybe increased sulfate availability post-fire through demineralization or decreased bioavailability of something like nickel.
Yeah, I mean, it certainly could be that second, the latter. I personally think that it just burned too deep, and so it's a lack of availability. So this kind of lateral transition within the moderately burned site, where the community was just kind of had to work its way back up, isn't happening in the severely burned, and they have to regenerate from external sources. So they're just not coming back, is what I suspect.
Great,
Yeah, thanks,
thank
Colin.
you.
We have 3 more minutes. No?
Oh. Okay, well, we're going to hold Emma up here just 1 minute longer, just to see if there's any more questions. Any other questions?
So I know you told us to ignore those like 4 points from the high methane emissions from the severely burned. I'm curious, are those all the same site or were they different sites? I guess like what I'm wondering is, are there like microhabitats where there could be consistent, fairly large emissions of methane, or are those just like truly random?
Yeah, so there's actually only 3 sites. We have 8 collars at each of the sites. So it could be like an individual collar. It could be some like legacy carbon that's left over and just our being around there is causing a lot of ebullition. Could be a number of things. I don't imagine they were from the same collar. I think that would be pretty exceptional, and I would have hoped that I would notice that. But yeah, great question though.
Cool, thanks.
Yeah. Wonderful, thanks again, Emma.
All right. Thank you so much, Emma. Up next, we have Edmund Strawn, who will be talking about carbon dynamics in managed peatlands. So you can come on up, confirm we can see that online. All right. We got it down pat now.
Hi, everybody. Good morning. And my name is Edmund, and I'm here to talk about the carbon dynamics and managed peatlands. I would just like to thank everyone who helped me in my research lab, Fire Ecosystems Research Lab, that helped make this possible. And yeah, oh, where's the clicker? Oh, okay. So I came here today coming from the beautiful lands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh Nations. I would like to acknowledge, firstly, that this research took place on the Treaty 6 territories and the ancestral homelands of the Cree, Dene, Tsleil-Waututh, Blackfoot, Dakota, and Métis Nations of Alberta. And I would also like to acknowledge that, here at this conference, we have the ability to share our knowledge and stories on Treaty 6 territory as well. Now, in the essence of storytelling, please enjoy this short video.
Not too far away from where you live is a wetland habitat filled with biodiversity, and it is important for carbon storage. This is where PD Pete and his family live. They live in close family units to share water since they do not have roots. One day, mad scientists appeared and discovered PD Pete's family and realized all the wonderful uses they have. Those uses included agriculture, horticulture, alcoholic beverages, and aquatic soil. One day, as PD Pete and his family were enjoying their day, humans started coming into their village and began draining their land and vacuuming up his friends and family. PD Pete witnessed his friends and family disappearing, and his lands were no longer wet, but dry. To make matters worse, the fires that were normally suppressed in PD Pete's land were now causing major damage. Now that PD Pete's home was damaged by fire, all the carbon it had once stored over hundreds of years was being released into the atmosphere. Once the mad scientist realized the harm these activities and fire was causing to PD Pete's home and the environment, he knew he had to act fast. The mad scientist and his team of experts began embarking on a quest to research how much carbon was being released from PD Pete's home and how long it would take to restore PD's ecosystem.
So, what are peatlands? Well, peatlands are a type of wetlands that is characterized by partially decomposed plant matter, also known as peat. A bog, which is a type of peatland, is primarily fed by precipitation. In general, peatlands play a vital role in regulating atmospheric carbon and methane. So in Canada, peatlands contain an estimated around 150 gigatons of carbon, which is roughly equivalent to 128 billion gasoline-powered cars driven for a year. They cover approximately 1.1 million square kilometers in Canada across the Boreal and subarctic regions, and they are culturally significant to many First Nations, and they provide essential ecosystem services such as habitat provisioning and as well as, water filtration. So what are managed peatlands? Well, in Alberta, managed peatlands are considered a specialized type of mining and involves several key activities. Some of these activities include clearing surface vegetation, installing drainage ditches in order to lower the water table, tilling the surface of a peat to increase aeration, thus increasing the drying, and then just like what happened to PD Pete, vacuuming them up, and then essentially, transporting it and storing it in order for it to be exported to commercial markets. So what is the problem? Well, human-induced climate change is creating warmer and drier conditions. The carbon balance in peatlands is quite sensitive to environmental factors such as seasonal weather changes. And with drought and water table drawdowns, it is increasing soil respiration, aerobic decomposition, and thereby releasing more carbon into the atmosphere. Climate change is also contributing to increased wildfire activity within the Boreal regions, as wildfires can have severe and long-lasting effects on the carbon emissions, as well as creating ecological disruptions. And lastly, in Alberta, anthropogenic activities such as peat harvesting, urban expansion, oil and gas exploration, and mining are degrading these habitats. Drainage activities from harvesting is increasing the amount of peat that is exposed to aerobic decomposition, thus changing peat properties as well as the moisture content. Now, what we didn't know is how these impacts are interacting with wildfire disturbances. So what did we wanted to figure out? We wanted to assess the impacts of draining and wildfire on carbon emissions. We wanted to assess the changes in the vegetational communities post-fire. And we also want to assess how environmental variables interact with carbon emissions and how landscape position plays a role in these emissions as well. So how did we figure it out? Well, my friends and colleagues, we examined harvested and unharvested peatlands within the Drayton Valley. We looked at 3 sites in specific. The first one was a burn harvested site. The second one was an unburned harvested site. And the third was a burned unharvested site. So our methods, what we did was essentially we did daytime carbon respiratory flux measurements using a chamber as well as a gas analyzer. We also took vegetation surveys assessing the post-fire regeneration of vegetation. We did 12 plots per site, and they were 1 by 1 meter. And as well as we wanted to assess environmental variables such as soil moisture and temperature, as well as temperature at depth, and look at how that plays a role in carbon emissions and how, of course, position plays a role in carbon emissions. So we did some of these measurements at the center as well as the margin. And what we mean by margin is the transition zone between the center of the peat field as well to the upland forested region. So what did we find? Well, on the left-hand side, it shows our burned harvested site, our burned unharvested site, and our unburned harvested site. And we used a comparative analysis methodology just to kind of compare these two to see what was going on. We found that the burned harvested site was essentially emitting the most emissions comparatively to all our other sites. Secondly, our unburned harvested site, which in particularly I forgot to mention, was under active restoration. So active restoration actually managed to limit the carbon emissions that was coming out of the site. Now, our graph on the right-hand side is a breakdown between our landscape positional respiratory fluxes. So in orange, you have the margin, and in the gray, you have the center. And as we can see, landscape position plays a really key role in these respiratory emissions coming from these sites, as margins across all sites were high emissions. Now, when we did an analysis and we were looking at the variations between sites, we found that our burnt harvested site, which I also forgot to mention, that was left to naturally regenerate following a fire, was not statistically different from our burned unharvested site, which I also forgot to mention, was that it was burned, but it was surrounded by actual peat harvesting activities. And of course, there was no harvesting activities actually occurring in that site. So that just kind of highlighted that burning plays a key role in the carbon dynamics within these systems. The other thing we were looking at was temperature. We found that surface temperature was a really key factor. Figure A is just looking at surface temperature, comparing it to our carbon emissions. And then B is our burned harvested, C is our burned unharvested, and D is our unburned harvested site. And as we can see, margins were the biggest kind of like relationship that was found between carbon emissions. Now, for our vegetational plots, on our left-hand side, we have our margin plots, and on our right-hand side, we have our center plots. We found that vascular vegetation was really predominant within the marginal ecotone, We also found that upland species such as trembling aspen and birch were coming into the center positions, kind of indicating a regime shift from vegetation that we would expect from a post-fire to vegetation that is non-peatland. So what should we do about it? Well, peat operations should employ active restoration. Active restoration can include rewetting, which is filling in these drainage ditches. They can apply the straw layer to decrease evaporation, as well as increase moisture content on near surface. They can also employ the moss layer transfer technique, which is, of course, taking sphagnum moss from a donor site and planting it within these peat fields to encourage sphagnum colonization. So why should you care? Well, peatlands are important to the carbon dynamics. They store a lot of carbon. Of course, as you saw from the video, they're economically viable and important to Canada. And as well as we, as the mad scientists, we should do everything we can to save Petey Pete and his family. Thank you.
Thanks, Edmund. I'm personally thrilled that Petey Pete made it to his a wider audience. This is great. Questions? I saw a hand over here.
Thanks for the talk, Edmund. And I will say I'm biased, but you have the coolest last name, although you mispronounce it. I've worked in the Drayton Valley area. We've done some stuff on there. So there's 34,000 hectares total that have been harvested. So what proportion is burned? Do you know?
I don't know the exact proportion that is burned. I was only specifically looking at sites that were on kind of like a peat extracted control site.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The industry would know those numbers. I'm guessing it's small.
Hopefully, yeah.
Yeah, it's pretty small.
It's pretty small, yeah.
They're pretty significant in their carbon. Anybody else? Yes, Maria.
Hi, Edmund. Thanks for the presentation. Because you mentioned your unburned harvested was restored, were there pretty big water table differences across the sites, and how might that contribute to the carbon fluxes you measured?
Yeah, that's actually a great question because actually our burned harvested site, the burned harvest site and the unburned harvested site, we did find had a very flashy water table, and actually the water table for most of the growing season was quite low. So we tried to link that towards our respiratory emissions, but unfortunately we didn't have enough data points to really draw a significant conclusion. However, based on some of the other environmental variables that we did look at, we did find that within the margin at the active restoration site, the margins were a lot wetter than what we would expect from a harvested site. And therefore we felt like, it was drawing to that conclusion that wetter was keeping the respiratory fluxes quite low, even for a harvested area.
When it was dry, I think.
Oh, yeah, of course. Yeah, of course, Maria. Yeah, no problem.
Any other questions? All right, then thanks, Edmund.
Cool. Thank you, everybody.
All right, thank you so much, Edmund. Up next, we have Bidya Sharma, who will be talking about something near to my heart, impacts of permafrost thaw. So take it away.
Thank you. I have a lot of time, which is good because I think I'm running a bit longer on the time scale. So, good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming to my presentation. Today, I'm going to talk about my fairly ongoing work. So I don't have a complete story, but I'm going to try nevertheless. I'm looking at the permafrost thaw on long-term carbon storage. So like with all the, we leave the surface processes behind and we go underground with this presentation. And I'm looking at from plateau to fen gradient. And then in the picture there, you can exactly see the ecosystem that I'm working at. On the very left, the green part is when there's active tree in a peat plateau. On the edge, it's like where it's like dying trees. And then there's like expanding channel in the middle. This happens in the discontinuous permafrost zone in northwestern Alberta, sort of. And it is important because it's predicted that potentially the permafrost peat plateaus in discontinuous permafrost zone are thawing so rapidly that the time scale we're looking at is decadal to like a century scale when they're gonna represent wetlands southern to the permafrost border. So, and then, we see the scars of this everywhere we walk in the landscape. So it's like a mosaic of peat plateaus, bogs and fens and ponds. So around 35%, 40% is covered by peat plateaus. And 25% of the landscape, of the peatland landscape, is bogs, around 30% is fens, and then 5% is ponds. So we took two sites, Finn's Fen, that comes from the name of my colleague that has like a long-term instrumentation site, so we give her the credit for there. And another is Lutos. So Lutos has previously been studied mostly for bugs, so like thaw into the bugs. So I think we kind of fairly know something about permafrost thawing into bugs. So now it was like a new puzzle of looking at the same thing in channel fens. So in both sites, we kind of think they're a bit different in when they form, but we think they kind of formed in a similar manner after deglaciation and when the river on the right-hand side changed its course. And in both sites, we look at same transect that goes from peat plateau, so that's treed towards edge, that's like very actively thawing, and we see that in the toppling over of trees once it starts to become a bit more wetter. And then we go towards the center where it's very sedgy and it's very wet, so distinct in terms of hydrology as well as vegetation. And the two sites are around 20 kilometers away from each other along the Mackenzie Highway. So here's my very bad attempt at the schematic diagram, but just showing like the same transect. So we go from peat plateau towards like what we call a mature fen. So thinking that it thawed the longest time of all the thermocrast fens. And some terminologies to keep in mind is like new fen peat is anything like in green that accumulated after the thaw. The orange is always the plateau peat, so like peat that formed when particular location had forested plateau developed in it, and then old is everything before the plateau graded in specific locations. So overall carbon balance, we divided into two main questions, thinking of what's happening with the accumulation of new carbon, because like peat plateaus are not very productive ecosystems. So they are treed, but it's very dry. So they go through like aerobic decomposition. So there's not much of accumulation happening. But once it thaws, it kind of resembles a wetland, and there's the accumulation rate is quite faster. So that kind of draws our attention to the first question of, okay, how much of new accumulation do we have, and is it bigger than what we normally see in a peat plateau? And the second question, and of course I think this is the most obvious one, is what happens to all that old peat that was frozen in a permafrost plateau, right? So all that become unfrozen, potentially just by the logic of it would increase decomposition and get more mineralized just because it's more accessible now. So in both sites, we kind of tried to follow like the similar sampling pattern, and we had one transect in both sites. In Fin Fen, it was quite shallow, about 1.3 meters, and we have 5 full cores. In Lutos, it was very deep, so it was impossible to take a lot of cores. So we have 3 full cores in the thawed part, and the peat plateau where it was ice underneath, it was very hard to core, so we couldn't go all the way to 5 meters. So we have only about 100 centimeters depth. So that's how deep we went in Lutos. So it was a lot of fun expedition. And for the results, what I'm going to do is I'm going to first talk about like the development history using macrofossils, so which is basically, taking peat sample at each like 5 or 10 centimeter depth and looking at what made it, like what kind of vegetation remains we can see in each depth. And then that kind of allows us to, say that, okay, they all formed in a similar way until they thawed, and then they took different trajectories. So that allows to say that any differences we are seeing is because of the thaw. And then after we have established that, we try to, we construct carbon stocks, we calculate them, and then also think about peat biogeochemistry to see if one is more decomposed than the other. So first, I'm going to take to Finn's Fen, and I'm going to take you to the plateau. So this is where the forested part would be. It's a lot of colors. But I think what I really want you to focus is different classes of vegetation that we see, and I've classified into dry brown mosses that we see on top of a plateau, wet brown mosses that are more fenny, herbaceous, so more like sedges remains that we see, and ligneous like the forested remains. And I think what I just like the figures here, the images are for illustrative purposes only. So we see like needles, seeds, and mosses. And I think the takeaway is the basal age was 3,460 years old. Most of the peat formed under fen conditions, and it is only in the top 20 centimeters that the site developed into a permafrost. So that's where the black line, anyway. And then I'm not going to go through like each of the transect, but just taking you to like I say old fen, but it's the mature fen, like the one that thawed the longest time ago. And again, on the top part, we see like the wet mosses because present day it's a fen. Underneath, we see a layer of sphagnum around 8 centimeters, and underneath we see like a ligneous layer, and that's where like where the plateau signs are. So right, it used to be a plateau at some point, and after it thawed into a bog somehow, and then I think once the hydrology got more connected, it now represents more fen vegetation. So that's where we think the plateau layer kind of happened. So just walking through like the rest of the core, so like the plateau edge is something we think is similar to plateau. It's just that there's no ice underneath, it has melted. And the young fen, it was most recently thawed, and the intermediate fen, it was thawed a bit longer time than the young fen. And we see like the plateau peat remains in each of the transects, so that kind of validates our space for time chronosequence, that they kind of started forming around the same time and show same trajectory of development. So next I'm going to take you to Lutos, like similar story. We see like plateau on top, so there's no denying there. And then underneath we see a lot of sphagnum. So I think what it kind of tells that unlike the other site, it used to form as a bog and then recently aggregated into permafrost, maybe in like last 1,000, 1,200 years. And this one, you'll see that it's the peat plateau, so we couldn't go to all the way depth, so it's only around 3,020 years old. Similarly, so this is the mature fen, the one that thawed the longest time ago in Lutos. And here there's like dry mosses and wet sphagnum mosses on top, and then we see the remains of like the plateau peat, mostly in form of like very burnt charcoal, like woody pieces around 90 to 100 centimeters. And most of the history is sphagnum. So it's kind of telling us like, okay, like even though it's a present day fen looking ecosystem, it used to form as a bog, and because of the hydrological connectivity and so on, it now represents a fen. So it's kind of different on how two different sites developed. And this one is around 8,000 years old, like just showing the other two locations of intermediate and young fen, where young fen, the plateau layer that we see is at the shallowest. So that's like the history of development. So we kind of validated, I mean, I'm still waiting to have like the radiocarbon data so that I can validate like also with the timescales. So it's so it might change just to warn everyone, but it kind of gives us more confidence in comparing carbon stock across the different locations in the transect. And while doing that, what I did here is take the full carbon stock and divide them into different stages that we saw. And I think in Finn's fen, one thing is very clear is there's a gain of new carbon in the mature fen, like progressively more in the mature fen. And there's no apparent loss of old carbon. So that's the takeaway. In Luto's, however, it's very complicated, and I cannot tell you why until yet. So we can't really compare the plateau stage because we only have until 170 centimeters. But in the fen, as we go towards mature fen, there's decreasing old carbon. So this, I'm not sure why. I'm waiting to data on like the peat quality, so I can say like it's more degraded because it had been thawed for the longest time, or it could be just a spatial variability. So this I don't know, but one thing that is very certain is there's an increased accumulation of new carbon on top. And just thinking about the Lorca, we know that the thawed fen has a higher accumulation rate than peat plateau, potentially driven by the new carbon accumulation on top of thawed fens. So only for Finn's fen, I have biogeochemical properties, and just looking at C/N ratio and FTIR, so kind of tells us how decomposed the peat is. There's no indication that like the mature fen that thawed the longest time ago has more decomposed peat than that of peat plateau. So it might be different case in Lutos, just because like in fen peat is already very decomposed, but in Lutos, most of it was sphagnum moss, right? So it is more labile and has potential to be lost more. But then I don't know that yet, so I'll have to wait more results to see. So summary is that ecosystem develop in many different ways. So, it used to be a bog and now it's a fen now, or it can be a thaw as a bog, and then once the hydrological connectivity comes in, it can develop into a fen. That kind of complicates on how this ecosystem might react after thaw. There's new carbon accumulation after thaw, and I need further data to validate any losses of old carbon. Next steps, a lot of next steps. So we want to compare with bogs so that we can upscale at a regional scale for discontinuous permafrost reason, and then also dating and creating some age depth profiles is the next thing to do. Want to thank our funders and our collaborators. Thank everyone for listening, and also want to acknowledge that our work is done in Territory 8, and we're always grateful to have the opportunity to work sometimes also with the communities. And I'll take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vidya. Any questions? Yeah.
Really interesting talk. I'm especially interested in sort of the cores that you collected and the successional phases that you're capturing there. I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit more about some of the patterns you saw. So you mentioned that you saw signatures of potentially charred material, so that burnt layer, and also the fact that most of these had bog in their past. So whether there's indicators for how hydrology might be linked to those fire signatures and what that might look like over time, if you've considered it. If not, I would love to chat later about thinking more about
Sure,
it.
sure. Yeah, so I think one thing that was very surprising for me, I mean, I was looking at like, key dominant vegetation type, right? Like treed or like bogs or like mosses or sphagnums and so on. But like seeing charcoal was something that was like very interesting to me. So I think I'm still waiting to get like the ages so that I know if there's like a lot of fire activity, so I know which age that corresponds to, and then that gives us probably more idea about like the climate around that time and why we are seeing certain things. But I do generally think I mean I don't want to like I have to look more closely, but I think every time there's like a peat plateau stage, I do see more incidences of fire, and I think this is what we know from like the present day climate as well. But talk to me later. Thank you.
Wonderful. Any other questions? All right. Well, if everyone's eager for lunch, then we'll let you go. Thanks for joining this session. We have part 2 after lunch, so we'll see you then.
Thank you.